Well, hello everyone, and thank you. You should be hearing something now, guy. Um, Thank you, everyone. My name is Brad Dickson. Good, all set. Image and sound. I'm hearing from people. All right, yeah. My name is Brad Dickson. I'm a retired senior lighting designer from CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I was there for 37 years. I created the first all LED lit newsroom. I've been dealing with LEDs for a number of decades. We created LEDs at CBC before they were actually on the market. So we've been dealing with them for some time. The other person on the line is James Brooks. He is a software developer and he's the owner of Drastic Technologies. They have a product called 4K Scope. And he was nice enough to listen to me and get some ideas into his scopes. And that's why we created the HS scope to make calibration and evaluation of LED lights graphically simple, all based on the camera. So let's begin. So any questions, feel free to click in the ask questions section there because I'll probably miss a lot of the chat stuff happening. All right. So LED lighting. According to manufacturers, it all matches. It's all balanced. It's all fine. In practicality, we found that it's not the case. So how do you turn around and judge it? Do you go by numbers? Do you go by meters? Do you go by whatever? Again, I've had this issue decades ago, and I've solved it by basically going along and looking at some of the basic facts. The fact is, light that we create falls onto the image sensor and creates colors, creates chroma values. Well, we actually have standards. Sept and other organizations have put standards out where those colors should sit in the video signal. So when we start looking at the simple process, we have a light. It hits the image sensor. The image sensor then transfers that into an electronic signal of luminance and chroma. And if we look at a reference chart like the DSC, chroma de Mont, we see there's sections in there specifically to evaluate chroma and luminance. So, luminance. Okay, we can, if need be, look at a waveform scope. That's fine. And again, looking at DSC Labs grayscale, there we go. There's where all the chips should sit. But that requires a camera, that requires the chart, that requires all these different elements. Well, I want something handy, handheld. I've got that in a light meter. I can now calibrate that light meter to what the specifics of the camera I'm using. So now luminance I've got in my hand, so to speak, as a reference. I've got that light meter, I can measure things, and I can relate that to the camera. So do I need the waveform? It's good to have, nice to have. Is it a need to have? No, my light meter, I can rely on that. So that's a tool that's worthwhile. What about chroma? Okay, well, actually, the portion of the electronic signal, the chroma portion, we can measure and plot it with regards to its hue and saturation values. So we can say where it sits in this circle, so to speak, which vector point it sits, and to what degree of saturation it sits. Well, that's nice. So let's try and look at that in electronic form. Well, we can use a vector scope. And that's essentially what a vector scope does. It basically looks at the hue and saturation of the chroma signal and puts it in those values. So now, okay, these are the color bars from the Sept color bars, and we've got the vector points where those colors should be sitting. So essentially, as the other image I showed, we've got to the center, we've got the white portion. As we go further away from the center, we've got deeper saturation. Okay. I'm familiar and comfortable with a vector scope, but for a lot of people, it's a little bit unfamiliar territory. Now, color meters. Well, there's our answer. We can get all these great and wonderful numbers. Okay, the problem that I found, of course, is that Unlike for luminance, that I can adjust my light meter and calibrate it so it's basically similar to the camera, I can't do that with color meter. I can't say, oh, I'm using the Airy Mini, or I'm using the red, I'm doing, and here's all the processor, here's the chip, here's all this sort of stuff. I can get a lot of numbers. I can get a lot of other values, which is fine. I know what they are. I know how to use them. But I really want to see, well, what is this telling me how it's going to look on camera, right? So am I lighting for the light meter or the color meter, or am I lighting for the camera? Personally, I've always been lighting for the camera. Now, again, color meters, I've used them, I've got them, and you can get a lot of information. The issue that I find is that marketers of LED lights have really pushed the numbers. And in this case here, we look at those numbers and they're similar, they're close, but all of a sudden you look at the spectral distribution they put out and it's totally different. How can things be so close but be so different? And the real thing is, how does this all relate to the camera? Well, we can get numbers like correlated color temperature and Kelvin temperature. A lot of manufacturers intermix the two and they said, oh, yeah, here's a color Kelvin temperature of our LEDs. Well, it's actually correlated color temperature. Oh, here's CRI. That's really important. All of a sudden, that became important to people, and everybody jumped on the bandwagon. We got it. Here's our CRI. Okay, I usually ask manufacturers, so relate that to the camera. How does that relate? And I get a blank stare. Well, here's our spectral power distribution. Oh, okay, good. How does that relate to the camera? And once again, we start looking at numbers. Okay, about 3,000 correlated color temperature there. We got 99, 91, 83. And if we look at the one on the far right, if I added more of the red in there, I'd probably increase that CRI. But totally different results. So again, I'm very hesitant on the numbers. I know what they mean. For IES, yes, a lot of numbers are important, but for the camera, give me something that shows me what exactly the camera is going to see. Because I know that the image sensor differ in different cameras. Airy has their look. Everybody has a different look. If it was all the same, if the information we put into the camera gave us the same information out, why would we not just have one camera, right? So that's the consideration that we have to look at. We've got the luminance meter that we can adjust specifically to the needs of that camera, but the color meter, we can't adjust to the needs of that camera. Now, let's look at a reference like the DSC Labs chart. Why do we use that? Because all of the values that are on that chart sit exactly where they're supposed to sit with regards to the values set up by SMPTE and where they're supposed to match in the video display on the vectorscope. Now, just to note, if you look at a DSC Labs chart and said, well, that red really isn't that saturated. No, as a matter of fact, it's half saturated. The reason being is that they can ensure integrity in their printing process. So therefore, when you go onto a vectorscope, you actually multiply the signal by 2 times. So it's 2 times gain. So it basically increases it. So it compensates for that half saturation value. But that being said, the reason why we use and rely, and not just us, Sony, every manufacturer there is out there, you go to a trade show, there's a DSC Labs chart sitting there. They use it as reference because those colors are accurate to what the video signal is supposed to be. So that's why we use that as our reference also when we're using the HS scope. Okay, I bought a lot of LEDs when I was at CBC, and a lot of people brought their prototypes to us. As a matter of fact, Airy brought their prototype to us, and I showed them what we did to alleviate any of the small green issues that were in LEDs. We added plus and minus green features to it. And when they saw what we were doing, that's why they have plus and minus green in the area now, because they adopted what we did. Now, one manufacturer came to me and talked about their LED. And they said it was great and wonderful. You can adjust it all this variable color temperatures and go from there. And this was not a prototype. This was a product out for sale. And they were going on about, they've shown us different broadcasters, how everybody's loving it, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, that's great. Sounds wonderful. I'll show you how we test it. we tested on camera. So on the right, we have the DSC Labs chart lit to a true 3050 degree Kelvin source. And on the left, we have the LED, and I dialed it in to their numbers of 3050. Now, they've done testing, obviously. They've done whatever. It's a product that's out on the market now, right? And I said, now let's look at the chroma signal, which we did in the center, which is the vectorscope. And immediately I said, well, first off, you're into illegal color. You're outside the range and you're way off. And sorry, but what did you measure this by? How did you quantify it? And that's the whole key. A lot of manufacturers will put out information and you can get it from a meter. That's fine. But quantify it for me on camera. Quantify that I'm getting the results that you're claiming I'm supposed to be getting on camera. And that essentially is what the HS scope was designed for. We want to make it simple. So basically looking at the chroma signal that comes out of the camera. And again, we can use either the chroma de Mont as a reference, right? We light that up. The camera is shooting the chart. It comes in, we read that signal. What we've done is taken the chroma signal and put it in a simple spectral display. Now, in this particular case, we can also use the DSC Galaxy chart, which gives a nice smoother transition between the different points. Because in the chroma de Mont, you will find between chips, there's some colors in between, which is fine with the vectorscope because you can read it very easily. In this case here, if all of a sudden we go to something like Galaxy, then we get a nice smoother result. The bottom line here is this. All of those colors that are sitting there are accurate for the video signal. We have the DSC line sitting there. So if you were to get a result like that, you would know that you would get a full spectrum. You'd get an accurate color representation of all the colors that you're seeing on those charts. Pretty simple. If all of a sudden it's below that line or it's up and down here and there, you know it's not going to be accurate. Now, again, James with Drastic, their 4K scope, and they're also working on an 8K scope, just to let you know. But their 4K scope has many features to it. We're just looking at one of the features with regards to the HS scope. So there is many selectable scopes you can bring up. Okay, here's a clear-cut example. A manufacturer says, oh, here's our spectral power distribution. Okay. How does that relate to the camera? You might get a blank stare after that. Somebody says, oh, here's our HS scope reading based on this camera, based on whatever. This is what we actually looked at it. You can immediately sit back and say, oh, okay, yeah, you're meeting all the points there. That's great. So I know how it's going to look on camera. Well, that's good. You've done some testing for me. Of the two, the HS scope information from a manufacturer is much more reassuring. As a matter of fact, one manufacturer, and I'll show you the example next, came to us and said, hey, we like what you're doing. We want to quantify that what we're putting out is matching what we say it matches on camera. And in this case, it pretty well did. I mean, there's so minor differences in it that it's so slight. You can maybe see it on the HS scope there on the right in the red, but it's so minor that you're not going to notice a difference. And the bottom line is, I as an end user sit back going, okay, with that information, it becomes worthwhile. Okay, I've got a question here. I will go and answer that. Let's see what that is. Okay, let me start answering it. Because the vectorscope reads the image sensor from the camera, isn't that a correct reference that one can adjust the fixture to read out correctly for that camera? Yes, exactly, which is exactly what I ended up doing, right? And quite frankly, within the 4K scope, yes, you can use your vectorscope, not an issue. What the HS scope is doing similarly is it's just taking that chroma information and putting it in a linear form and a little bit more user-friendly and visually pleasing to the end user. But there's another feature it does, and I'll get into that in a second, where essentially we can actually store reference and calibrate our lights to that. So hopefully that answered the question. But yes, that's exactly what I used to do before. I used to calibrate everything on the vector scope. So we have the HS scope. And let's jump back over here. And basically, we've got apples with apples. Okay, we've got the DSC Labs chart lit on camera. We've got it lit with a tungsten source. And then we turn on, bring up the LED source going, it matches. Great. If a manufacturer publishes that, I sit back and said, I know you're going to look good on camera. But guess what? If all of a sudden you're at IBC, slip over and see Nicholas of DMG Roscoe, because they did that. So we actually looked at the Ariel Alexa Mini. We put that up, put it on the DSC Labs chart, read it in the HS scope, lit it with a 3200 degree true tungsten source, and then said, okay, DMG, let's put your light to your preset of 3200. And that's the results we got. And we sat back and said, well, you hit the mark. And as I say, that becomes for me as an end user going, great. Doesn't matter. Don't talk to me about CRI. Don't talk to me about SPD. Don't talk to me about TLCI. Don't talk to me about this and that. This result here sits back and says, oh, good. So the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. And we also did it on the red camera. So for the ARRI, for the red, DMG can sit back and say, yeah, 3200, we've got that. Alrighty. Okay, what happens if a manufacturer isn't accurate? Well, immediately you can see it, right? We've got one manufacturer on the right there who wasn't accurate. And you sit back going, oh, okay, so you're a bit off. Immediately you can tell it. And again, we're not basing on numbers. It's not, CRI. It's not anything like that. You can sit back and say where the problems are. Now, that being said, it also gives information back to the manufacturer to adjust their fixture, or the end user. If I can go in and control those values and I can adjust up and down and I get them accurate and I've got a reference, that's great. I can match them, right? And that's exactly what I used to do on the vector scope. So now I can turn around and be totally accurate and match, and it doesn't matter what color temperature I'm using. Whatever my reference is, I go from there. Okay. Here's a new feature that's been introduced. And now we can store the reference line. So, for example, on the left, we have a tungsten source lighting the DSC Labs chart on a camera. That is the resulting peaks. Now, James will get into a little bit more on this and also talk about how we level things off when we're dealing with a DSC reference. But for now, we're looking at basically the, so to speak, raw chroma coming in from the camera. And those are the peaks and valleys that it has. And as a matter of fact, Jeff Borrell was talking about that in an email I saw about the peaks and valleys. Well, there's the peaks and valleys on that camera specific to a tungsten source lighting the DSC Labs chart. Great. Well, we can store that. We can store that as a white reference line. What does that mean when we look on the right? Okay, well, we bring up that LED that's claiming to match a 3200 degree source tungsten, and we can see, no, you're off, right? Now, I can see that immediately. I've got that reference line there that we can see on the right. And let me just see if I can grab my, okay. So we can see this over here, and we can see that we're off here, and we've got way too much in the magenta range, not enough in some of the red areas, right? So we need to do some adjustment. Now, that being said, if that light is fixed and you can't do any adjustment, then as an end user, if you are going to be balancing it with tungsten, you've got to sit back and going, well, that's not really a viable light for on camera. Now, that being said, if I'm not using tungsten, let's say I'm using whatever light I choose, I can white balance to that specific light. That's fine. That now becomes your dominant light source. That becomes your light source that everybody else has to match. That's fine. You can still store those reference points. And now every other light coming in has to match that. So let's say, for example, I said, well, I'm never going to have tungsten. I'm going to have the DMG one, DMG mix, which is, again, we showed looks pretty good. I'm going to white balance to that. Good. What it means, that's my standard. That's where I want every other light to come in and turn around and match. Now, I know that Roscoe would love nothing more than to use nothing but their lights, but the reality is you probably intermix different lights. But what it does is, in the HS scope, is give you a point to match to. And if you can adjust the other light, as long as you're hitting those same reference points, then it's going to look the same on camera. And again, this is all based on the camera itself. Let's see if I'm over. There we go. Okay, so simple process. You light up the DSC Labs chart, goes into the camera, chroma signal comes out. And again, we can measure luminance, we can measure 4K scope measures lots of stuff. But right now we're just concentrating on the lighting. We get the readout as a vector scope if we want. We can choose, we can have the chromaticity where we sit back and say, is it in Rec 709? Is it a Rec 2020? All that information can be there. But right now we're just focusing on the HS scope. So the bottom line is we can sit back and say, are you hitting those peaks and valleys correctly? And I can now bring up a reference of those peaks and valleys. So therefore it'll be accurate. The other thing we can do is we can store that file for future. So if I don't have that camera hooked up to tungsten or lit with tungsten and all that stuff, I've got that reference file. I did it once. That's all I need. So I can bring it back up again. Okay, so LED lights need to be calibrated for camera. That's the bottom line. And as Jeff was, again, I've talked to different manufacturers about this, and there's one manufacturer is looking at doing that precisely because they know there's an issue. How they're tackling it is a little bit different. I just think that the HS scope makes it easy for everybody now. So now you can calibrate it specific to your look. The other thing too is that you can actually ensure that the look that you set up is maintained. So let's say, for example, you've got a specific color that you've got on set. Well, it'll actually show on the HS scope. It'll show that reference. You store that, you bring it up, and if all of a sudden you've got control with the lighting console, you can say, oh, sorry, we're a little bit off. We need to adjust some of the red or the green and get it back to where it was. Now you got that reference all the time on file. Now, just to add a little bit of humor here, here's a t-shirt being given from one colorist to the other colorist. I love the philosophy because that's my philosophy, is if we can fix it on set, why don't we? Everybody says, oh, we can fix it in post. And one lighting director at CBC had a great line is, well, why don't we shoot it in post? It's like, why are we wasting so much time in front of the camera, right? If we can do everything in post, why don't we go there? The bottom line is the HS scope gives you that ability to fix it on set. Or conversely, you start asking your manufacturers when you're at IBC, where's your HS scope readings? Because that'll tell me right now how viable your light is. That's what the HS scope is going to do for you. It's because basically going to sort out what works on camera and what doesn't work on camera, what things I need to adjust it'll give you the reference point that you can store and say, I've got to hit these points and go from there. All right, well, that's my section. And I'm going to hand it over. Oh, sorry. One other thing, now that we've got this very quickly. For those attending, as a little bit of a bonus, DSC, they're not sponsoring this. I'm not sponsored in any way, but I was able to work out a code with them. The CYWBD code, if you use that, you get 20% off their DSC One Shot Plus. So you go onto their online website and in the apply code, you stick the CYMBD there and you get a 20% discount on one of their charts. Very useful chart created by Art Adams, by the way, another DP. All right, well, I'm going to hand this over to James Brooks. He's online and I will bring up the, let me go over here. I will bring up the HS scope for you in his. There we go. And I'm handing it off to James. So James, it's all yours.
Thanks, Brad. Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. There's already a question.
Okay, I'll bring that up. When you measure from the camera, oh, let me start answering. Okay. Hit the answer. When you measure from the camera, is there any difference in the way it is read? Meaning from an SDI 1080 HDMI output, or is it different from a media card recorded at full resolution, log or raw. Okay, James, I'll let
Oh,
that
yeah.
one be for you.
Absolutely, but they're all based on the same sensor. So if you're talking about getting the light right, you can tell if the light's right coming through Rec 709 or 2020. And then when you record raw, if you have, say, 3 different lights, you match them up on the 709, when you get them in the raw, they will also be matched because the sensor itself is the same. The transformation from that sensor to the test instrument is the same. So although they won't be, the 709 will not be the same as raw when you get it out, the raws will match each other. So yes, as Brad said, I'm James Brooks. I'm with Drastic Technologies. This is our 4K scope, which is a general waveform vector scope software available for Windows, Linux, and Mac. The part we're focusing on today is the HS scope, which is something exclusive to our software at the moment. The HS scope is a hue saturation scope, so it is designed to work in the hue and saturation to map out colors from a known source, in this case one of 3 DSC charts, so that you can calibrate against cameras, you can emulate cameras, and you can calibrate light to light. So right now what you're seeing on the screen is a tungsten calibrated with my camera calibrated so that it is flat when that light is a natural tungsten. The first thing I'm going to show is actually the thing that Brad was just saying, which is our floating reference, which lets you match up lights naturally against the same camera. So I can reset my calibration, and now I get the camera, what the camera sensor is doing to that light coming in. So now I might adjust my camera to get that closer, but it's fine where it is. What I want to do now is basically match up my light. So I have my tungsten light here. So I'm going to set a curve, and I'm going to show it. And you can see here, hopefully, a white line that has mapped itself around the various colors coming from this chart with that light. If I then shut down that light and bring up my LED light, you can see that we've got, they're both calibrated for the same Kelvin, but we have a difference in how the light's actually coming through the camera. So missing some of our reds, some of our blues, the greens are a little bit over. And at this point, if I had control of either the path or the light itself, you could then bring that in to line with the other light. And you can go along all your lights and do this. The nice thing about this particular curve is if it's not just a white light, but a creative light, it will also bring up just the colors that are within that light, and then, or a gelled light versus a emulated gel. You can match them again with whatever control you have to make sure that your lights are the same all the way across, even if they're from different manufacturers. You can also load and save just the curve part of this, and you can load and save the images. So you can bring them back up against one another and even compare a shot image against an image that is coming in live for real-time comparison.
And those saved images are worthwhile for manufacturers to produce because basically, like I showed, it'll tell you right away how close they are and if they've made it. Like I say, DMG Mix have those images that we did with theirs, and they can sit back and going, I mean, if you're at IBC, go up and see Nicholas and say, hey, I hear you did this. It's like he's got them. He knows that the case is. So the bottom line is DMG quantified their claims. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, the next thing I'm going to talk about is how we did that. So if you want to look at, especially to carefully compare different lights, what you want to have is a simple way to see, especially for white light, what's going on. So every camera will have different different transfer functions from their signal, and you'll get different colors coming in at different levels. So one of the first things we built was the calibration. So given a camera and a DSC chart, we can set a calibration, and what that will do is it will take out all of the peaks and valleys from that camera and give you you've got an ideal chart, you've got an ideal light, and now you're seeing it as that ideal value. So this DSC line is the target line for, and it's all averaged around that now, even though my camera, of course, is not a perfect camera. So then once you have that set, as you switch lights, you can tell immediately if it's flat or not. So I've calibrated to my LED light. If I bring my tungsten back up, there's the differences. That's the expanded difference between those lights. So it's even easier to see in this case than the original line, which I'm going to actually take off. If I now calibrate to my tungsten, which would be most normal, then I bring my LED light back up. Now you see it's the opposite. Now everything that was over on the before is now under. So it shows you the differences between those lights. And even while it's in that calibrative mode, of course, you can then also use this curve. So it's not just, that curve is not just in the open mode, it also works against the calibrated signal. The other cool feature about the HS scope is I can calibrate the camera I'm using, and that camera could be anything from an ARRI and a RED all the way down to a webcam. And we can calibrate any of them. Now, granted, the ARRI and the RED are going to give you a much better signal with requiring much less calibration than a Logitech webcam. But the point is that you can also calibrate a webcam, and then you can load a calibration from an ARRI and set it as an emulation. So here I have some ARRI captures that I made before. So when I load that in, it actually changes the signal. So it's responding to chroma the way an ARRI would against the calibrated source, which we just did with the quote unquote webcam, which means that if you have your emulation curves, either from us or you make your own with whatever cameras you want to use, those cameras can be not on set. You can use a much less expensive camera to do all of your light work for weeks in your prep. And then when it comes time to check it, you check it with the emulated camera of the one you're going to use so that it's going to match up with what you're finally going to be recording.
And just added note with regards to that, I know that to make this very practical, having it handheld would be very handy. And I, as an end user, I'm aware of that. And James and I are already talking about this. So making this, so to speak, your go-to color meter is really going to be the case. The other thing, too, is that we can then put in the different cameras that you want, as James has said. So you are now going to have references to what the camera actually sees in that unit, in your handheld device. And you're going to say, oh, I've got the ARRI Mini. Okay, and let's go to its preset 32. Here's what it's supposed to look like. And I can now use my device with the DSC Labs chart, look at your light, and evaluate it. So if I'm walking around IBC and I've got that, I sit back and I said, well, all your numbers sound great and wonderful, but let me check it. And I can turn around and go right there and I can tell immediately, well, I'm going to use the ARRI Alexa Mini. And according to its reading, you're off.
So, and just back to the previous question, there is also a vectorscope in here if you prefer that as your way to view things. To help with calibration, you can set a low pass so you can see the chips more easily, and there's the 2 times. So the thing is the chart is exactly perfect. I should adjust my camera at this point or my lights to hit all these points. But let's say that's not what I want to do as a creative choice. Let's say as a creative choice, I don't want it to be purely white. That's where you start seeing the real advantage of the HS scope versus a vector scope. If I wanted this particular response you're seeing here, it would be very difficult for me to then go to another light and hit these points that are not marked. In the case of our scope, we have markers you can place, like I'm doing here, little X's all over. So you can do it, and we can also bring up your previous shot and your main shot and switch between them. So there are ways to do it. But if you calibrate your HS scope, then you don't have to think about any of that. Whoops. Sorry. Full screen. There. Sorry, I went full screen on 2 screens. There we go. You don't have to think about any of that because you're just trying to either hit the line or you're trying to hit the recorded line.
Okay, James, you got two question here. All
Oh,
right,
once a thank you. You're welcome.
there we go.
If
All
you're
right,
mixing,
so I'll leave this one for you. I'll start
okay.
the answer.
So if you're mixing features, tungsten LEDs, how is the calibration using the HS scope helpful? That is intended for only calibrating one source of light. No, actually quite the opposite. So you would pick your primary light, in this case probably the tungsten, because it can't be changed. So you do your initial calibration with your camera to the tungsten, and then you would use that calibration either by the white line or by the DSC line to then bring all of your other lights into agreement with that initial light.
Yeah, and just to add in, basically, what happens if all of a sudden you're doing a mix of both of them, and you sit back and said, "Well, I'm in a mixed lighting situation. Whatever the lighting situation is, what I'm getting." Again, if all of a sudden you're calibrating your camera to it or you're balancing to it, then that's, as James saying, that's your starting point. That's your reference point. All other lights have to come to that level. Again, it doesn't have to be a tungsten. It can be, like I said, we can use a DMG mix and put that on and said, well, we're calibrated to that. Everything else has to come to this. What it does do is create everything at the same starting point. Again, if you want everybody's faces to look blue and do whatever, that's fine. But at least you want a starting point where you know that, okay, everything is accurate now, and then I can go from that accurate point and move on. That's basically what happens.
And one other thing, if you can't calibrate your lights, one of the things you can do is we can capture the scopes as a PNG or a JPEG, like I have here. And you can send that along with the shot to your colorist. And then if there's a huge, say there was a huge amount of green or blue in here, they would know the first thing they're going to want to do is pull that out of there because that light is producing too much. I mean, I know a lot of colorists can see that with eye, or you can use a chart to bring it in on the actual creative software. You could just use the Chroma Demond to bring it in on their vector scope. But if they just want to quickly calibrate it, this is an easy way to see where they're going to be working.
Okay, James, we got a question here, and I guess we can talk. All right, maybe I'll answer this. All right, I'll start answering this one.
Okay.
Okay, so the question is, when you talk about adjusting lights with a different profile, are you referring to bicolor or RGB? The answer is yes to both. So the bottom line is, for example, if it's a bicolor, I try and get as close as I can. If I'm too high in portions of the spectrum, then I would go back to the tools that we had before, gels, and I could filter out portions of the spectrum. But what it would show me is a lack of the spectrum. And of course, I can't add that portion in a bicolor section. And I sit back going, okay, well, you're lacking here and there. I'd rather have more than that I can filter out. In the case of the RGB, yes, we can turn around and do the same. But then, of course, you've got RGB AW lights. You've got so many mixes of different lights that are around, different values that come in with regards to the capability of adjusting that different manufacturers have addressed it different ways. But if all of a sudden you're looking at, for example, a chip on board light, which is a lot of lights that I dealt with, I turn around, look at that, and I will sit back and say, okay, well, how close are we given the phosphor makeup that they've gotten? And I can look at that on the scope itself and say, right, your phosphor composition is pretty good. In a lot of cases, I would find them shifting to the green. Fine, let's add in a little bit of minus green gel, but then I'm getting a good look from it. So yes, basically, when I'm talking about adjusting, it really is light specific. And this is why manufacturers have gone to RGBA, RGB AWW, and warm white and that sort of thing. So it depends on the manufacturer itself.
And just one other point on the bicolor. We work with a group of guys who do a YouTube show, and they're not well funded. They don't have much money. So where they're shooting, there's a bunch of ambient lights, just the fixtures in the ceiling. And then they have a bunch of newer lights, which are inexpensive bicolor LED lights. And their control is two knobs on the back of how much of the two types of LEDs you want for each. So they were able to actually use the HS scope to figure out what the Kelvin temperature and the target was of the overhead ambient lights, so they could then at least match those and then match those white balance in the camera, so they get a great looking shot with basically a random assortment of lights using a random color.
One other note too is that again, when we're talking about having this as a bit of a handheld system that you can take around, portable system, and again, we're talking about emulating the camera, so you don't have to have the camera hooked up. But here's the bonus: you can now take that and put it on set and actually hook up your production camera as a reference. So now it's not just a standalone item, and actually go on set and you go from there. Now, one other note that there is, and James, I know you've got some gels there, so why don't we get into this section? A lot of people claim that they have certain colors, they match certain gel colors on camera. Okay, again, quantify that for me. Is it just by eye that you decided it is this way? Whereas, in fact, I can actually store a reference of a specific gel under a tungsten source. I don't know if you've got the tungsten light on now or the other light, but
right now it's LED.
Okay, throw the tungsten on if possible, and then we'll put a gel in front of it, and I can store that for this particular camera, whichever gel you want. I can store that as a reference, keep it in my file, right? And once I've got that, let's say, okay, well, whichever gel that is, right? So now I've got that gel. Okay, well, there we go. So now I've got the readout of that gel. I can store that, right, as a reference file. I've got that in my series, and anytime I'm trying to match that with an LED, those are the values I have to hit on an ARRI red, or an ARRI or a red, whatever camera I'm using. I can now store that specifically to it. Now, if all of a sudden I hit those values that the manufacturer says, oh, that's gel number, et cetera, I can sit back and say, no, it's not, because I can tell immediately.
Hey, Dave, just clip that on the LED.
Okay. So that becomes a reference for manufacturers who are trying to hit specific gel colors also. Again, if all of a sudden they say, oh, we're hitting this gel color, and we go from there. And again, just to let you know, again, working with Roscoe, when we looked at some of their gel colors, the person who was involved in matching them and getting them accurate was with us during the test, and we turned to him and we said, well, looks as though you earned your money. Because again, we did the test of a tungsten source with a gel on it, and then taking the Roscoe mix and saying, fine, give me your setting for that gel. And again, on the HS scope, it was very close, right? It was, in some cases it was bang on. So, but that's the whole point. Now you've got this stored as your reference. You can store all these reference files. So anytime you're going anywhere, again, with a handheld device, you can go along and say, okay, well, let me see how yours is matched to this. Again, it's based on the DSC Labs chart. You look at that and you sit back and said, you've hit it or you haven't hit it.
And just one quick word on charts. We're using the Chroma Demande because that is the common chart that everyone's going to have. If you're going to be doing work, especially if you're doing calibration work for actual lights, we recommend either the Dreamcatcher, or if you're going to buy a new chart, the Galaxy is definitely the best chart for this kind of work. It's going to give you the absolute most accurate curves possible. And once again, I'm not being paid by DSC. I just love their charts.
Yeah, and it's not just us. It's not just broadcasters around the world, but we're talking about camera manufacturers around the world. We're talking about NASA. We're talking again. I'm not going to be a pitch person for DSC. Basically the proof is in the customers, that they can speak for themselves, and their product speaks on their own just by the customer base itself. That's why we've gone to it, because it actually has exact references to the camera, and SMPTE recognizes them also. SMPTE actually sells their charts on their SMPTE website. But all right. Well, any feedback from people? I know we've got some questions. Hopefully, this has answered the age-old problem of, how do I know how your lights are going to look on camera? How do I calibrate my lights? How do I evaluate the lights? Again, Roscoe did it, right? And as I said, Roscoe, and I'd like to see more manufacturers get on board, and that's only going to come about by end users start going to manufacturers and saying, well, I want to see your HS scope readout, because it can tell you immediately. Again, all the other numbers, if you want numbers, that's great and wonderful. I don't despair people putting out numbers. It just doesn't have an immediate reference to me like the HS scope does. I can sit back and say, there's the ARRI Alexa Mini. Here it is tungsten. Here it is matched. Exactly, right? That's the example that we gave. Any other questions that are coming up? Does anybody have any questions? Then, oh, there we go. We got a question there. We'll pop it up. What does the HS scope? Oh, okay. 1 second. I'll just hit the answer. What does the HS scope is actually doing when changing the value of a light to match it to another light?
It's actually matching. It's the only time we change the values is to match a camera or a sensor. We don't actually change the values to the light. The light, ideally, the light would get changed to match what you see in the HS scope.
Right. And the other thing we did, just to let you know, when we did our tests, is we went to the preset values of the cameras. So, for example, on the ARRI Alexa, when we were looking at it at 3200, we went to the preset values. So that's what was coming out of the HS scope. So that's what it ends up doing. And again, it's one of those where the argument is, well, what, can't I just white balance to those lights? Sure. Are you going to white balance to every light that there is that's miscalibrated all along? Oh, let's fix it in post. Okay, no, let's just shoot it in post. No, it's fix it on set, or at least have the big thing is, let's have manufacturers use this tool and present it to end users, so they sit back going, okay, good, we've done these tests, at least we've got something we can go from there. Oh, got another question. Let's answer that one. What form do you see the handheld device taking? Will it be incorporated into an existing device? Yeah, as an end user, there's lots of things we're talking about. Let's just say I want to make it as user-friendly as possible. That's a discussion.
It's not going to be its own device. So it's going to run on an Android tablet and hopefully eventually an iOS tablet or phone device. Those are the targets. With the Android, it's especially good because not only can you use the camera in the device, but you can also connect third-party stuff like the Azure UTab to bring in real FDI signals directly into the device.
So yeah, that's what we're targeting. And the other thing too is that now with the, and this is why I was leaving it to James now that he brought it up. Basically, as he said, we could have a Android tablet and then have that camera calibrated to that tablet, to the different cameras that are out there as far as the response signal goes. Then the tablet itself will emulate that. So if all of a sudden I would walk around with IBC or NAB or whatever, any trade show with it, with the DSC Labs chart, and now look at your light under that chart, I can say, let's put up the red emulation. And I bring that up and I can now get an HS scope readout of it. And I can see whether or not you match or not. Then, of course, as James was saying, I can now take that tablet, stick it on set if I need be. And as you said, the Azure UTab is a good example. Stick that in, take the SDI out from the actual camera itself, the red camera, and there I've got all my readings too. So now if I'm on set going, oh, okay, yeah, I like this look or whatever, can we store an HS scope value of that so when we come back to it, we've got it? Or conversely, it's like I want to make sure, like we're shooting this, I'm going to be back 3 months from now or whatever the case is. I want to make sure that Roscoe 50 look that we had, I want to make sure that we maintain that. So store that file. Let's bring it back. And when we're adjusting again, I want to turn on, bring that back, because I may store that just as a former lighting board operator. I may store that as a color palette. That's great. I've got that in the mix, but I want to make sure we're accurate, and we go from there. The other thing too is that, for example, in one discussion we had with a DP, they were trying to hit Stereo yellow, and it's like they showed the examples of all the different values that everybody had from their light coming out, claiming it was to be that. The benefit there, if all of a sudden, if they said, no, here's a tungsten source, here is a gel on it that I specifically want to hit, and here's the value of it, they could sit back and then easily show the manufacturer going, no, on the ARRI Alexa, that's not the right color. I've stored it. Here's what it is. Now, it gives a direction specifically to the manufacturer to sit back and say, oh, what do we have to tweak? What do we have to adjust? Right now, a lot of manufacturers are doing it by eye, doing things like this. In this case, it just gives a clear roadmap. All right, another question that comes up, and I'll answer this one. So, any timeline availability of tablet version? Well, that's a question for James.
Yeah, so right now you actually use it on a Windows tablet. So the Microsoft Surface, I have an inexpensive little tablet that we're running around with that's Intel, Windows tablet. That all works today. On the ARM-based Android, which is the next target, certainly not IBC. You know, we would like to get it out sooner rather than later. I don't know if even NAB is realistic. So really, it depends on interest as to how many resources we put on it. We now know how to do it. We can do it. It's a matter of how does it fit in with our development. So let's say post NAB.
I think the other thing too is that it's going to be customer driven. Mm-hmm. That basically, when all of a sudden people start saying, "Hey, we saw this. This will do it." And again, from our end, we want to sit back and say, "Is this a thing that will help you or not?" I mean, from my background, I sit back and said, "Yeah, I've done this for a few decades. It's the way to turn around and do it." But that's my perception. If all of a sudden people start saying, "No, I want this. I want this," and sort of go from there. As James has said, if you want it right now, you can go out and buy yourself a Surface Pro and throw it on there, and we can calibrate the camera, and you've got everything, right? But again, it's just branching out to further ends. Okay, there's another question here, and I'll start answering that. LEDs are just continuous light spectrum. Tungsten is continuous light spectrum. What the HS scope calibration is doing to fill the gap in the discontinuous light spectrum to ensure matches into a full spectrum of the source. Let's say matching it to tungsten. Okay, I'll leave you to that one, James, because I've got an answer to it also.
That's a really interesting question. What I've brought up here are 3 different cameras looking at the same light. And you can see, get them all at once, you can see that depending on the camera, the chips are tighter or looser. So this is what I would expect from, these are the actual chips. If you look at the numbers here, those are the actual vector offsets for each of those chips. And you can see they fall down to nothing between the chips. On this camera, the camera actually, as part of what it was doing in its processing to get it out to us in, I forget, either 709 or 2020, it ended up processing some colors between, which get picked up here, similar to the lines you see between the points on a vector scope. And this camera here, this camera here had a huge amount of mixing going on so that you could almost not even detect where the chips are. So it's very much camera dependent. We don't actually do any, as you can see, we don't actually do any fill ourselves. We are giving you what the camera is giving us, but the cameras do fill. And the camera I'm using here, even, you can see, I need to get that gel off, but it has quite a bit of fill as well on its SDI outs.
So the bottom line is that when all of a sudden things are looking filled out as compared to individual chips, that's the camera itself. That's not the light. So as I say, when you're talking about a discontinuous source, you're absolutely right. It would be peak, 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 right? But how does that camera deal with those peaks? For example, it may mush them all together, like, as I say, one camera that we played around with did, right? So,
and here you can see I'm bringing up just an individual chip with the selector. And just by bringing up that chip, the less I bring up, the tighter it gets. But if you bring up the whole chip, the camera sensor itself is making more colors than there actually are on that chip on the actual chart.
That's why, again, the uniqueness of the HS scope is the fact that all of this is chroma based on the camera itself. We're not adding, we're not doing, we're just telling you in a visual form what the camera is telling you. And we're just trying to make it visually easier and have a reference that you can go back to if need be and calibrate to. So again, any more questions? I guess I got a question for people. Are we hitting the mark here? The bottom line is it something that you want? Is it something that you basically sit back and said, yeah, keep on going. We could turn around and go with this. I'll throw that out and we'll see on chat. Do you think, or we just,
or put a poll up?
Jeff, I wanted it last week. Okay. Well, Jeff, you know something? You might get it sooner than you think. We'll talk about it. Okay. All right. Well, I'm getting a lot of good responses. Yeah, if it's handheld. Yeah, I know, Glenn. Yeah, that's exactly where we want to go. Again, I'm an end user. You know, James is a software nerd, or not. I shouldn't say that, but anyways.
No, I'm proud to be a nerd.
Okay. The bottom line is that he's all onto that end. I'm thankful for the fact that he accepted what I was saying as a viable option. I've done this all the time with Regiscope. Totally happy with all the other scopes that are in the 4K scope and soon to be 8K. But I just wanted to bridge, because I worked in film and I worked in video and I did all that stuff. And I just want to bridge that gap for those people who aren't comfortable with scopes, to actually show them, hey, let's make it really simple. And also put it in a form that can be printed out by manufacturers in a publication that the end user can immediately see, okay, that I get this is how the camera sees it. This is how it's representing. So for example, with regards to the DMX mix or DMG mix, where it's like very simple. Here it is tungsten. Here is our light. Right. And again, with the reference line, we can sit back and say, here's the points you got to hit. And if all of a sudden they sit back, we're hitting those points. It's a no-brainer. Again, it's like a spectral power distribution, but in relationship specifically to the chroma values of the camera, just making it simple. Okay. I work, okay. Note from America. I work a lot in matching cameras. I only use DSC Chrome Demont, but HS Scope is really great for telling us what the camera is seeing. When will it be available? It's really exciting. Well, right now, Amara, you can put it on a laptop, or as James was saying, if you want a Windows Surface Pro, it works. All the 4K scope is out there now. It's a software. It's not, the HS scope is part of it. Some of the revisions on stuff when James releases the revision that you just did, that will be out up soon, right? Oh, it's up. Okay, well, all right. Everything you're seeing right now is available now. So if, for example, Amari, you want to use it on set or use it wherever you want to and incorporate it in your whole system, the HS scope is part of the 4K scope package from Drastic Technologies. It just needs an SDI signal in, and depending if you're doing 8-bit or 10-bit, James is like the Azure system because it just works, and you can decide how you want to bring that SDI signal in.
Yeah, in terms of SDI signal, you've got sort of Azure and Bluefish at the top. You've got Matrox, you've got Blackmagic, and then you have kind of your various UVC devices, the UTAP, the Magwell, the Inogeny, all those guys. That's kind of they all work, but in terms of quality, that's sort of how it goes.
Oh, sorry. I got to keep my eye on here. Got another question. Okay. All right. Well, let's start answering this first question. Is it better when the camera fills in the colors or when the chips are separated? Well, you know something? Every camera is different. They have their look. So you sort of sit back, is it better or worse? I don't know. Is an Arri Alexa better than the Red? Is the new Canon C500 better than this? It's a different look, a different processing look at how they deal with their colors, how they deal with everything is different, which is what I was harking back to, the fact that a color meter doesn't incorporate that into its readings. We're doing that. So again, go ahead. Go ahead, James.
But if you are a lighting manufacturer, it does matter. What you want is the camera that has the tightest chips possible. And then you want to go with the Galaxy to get the smoothest chroma possible, because you really want to see every single peak and trough. You don't want anything to be, because it happens to be between two chips.
Right, exactly. So again, the manufacturers, and this is why, for example, when we did stuff with Roscoe, they were saying, okay, well, let's look at the Alexa because our customers are using that. Let's look at the Red because the customer is using that also, so they can look at the specific units. But the benefit they've got is they can show you. Well, again, when we showed the Area Alexa how it sees the individual chips, here it is on that. Well, on the Red, it's not looking the same. How come? Just different processing, but the same light. They know that they've hit it in both cases.
And Jeff just noted that the colorists, of course, want it to be as tight as possible because they want the colors to be as consistent and accurate as possible. Now, there is a certain amount of spreading that happens because we're taking out the 709, in this case, of the camera. If you want, and this requires a higher end card, you can also take the direct 12-bit RGB from the camera. We support 12-bit dual link RGB. If you do that, of course, there's even less smearing because there's less processing.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions here. Someone just said I meant separated. Okay, I don't know if.
Yeah, I think that was about the the individual columns of light.
Okay. All right, here's another question. You're leading us to a great place, and it suggests that one could save a creative profile, and perhaps the profile could be a lighting LUT. Well, okay, not really a LUT, but that could be loaded into the LEDs, correct? Yeah. I mean, yes. Basically, I can store those values out and go from there, right?
But also, Brad, what you were talking about, like we could tie this into a lighting console and actually tell the console how to fix the light.
Yeah, I'll just finish the done answering. Okay, here's the bottom line. I was also a moving light operator. I operated consoles for a number of years. It bothered me to no end in the color pickers there. Again, have a reference to the camera. So what we're looking at is the fact of and talking to different manufacturers. And again, it's going to have to be users pushing this. If all of a sudden they worked with us and incorporated this into the system, we could actually pick a color that actually related specifically to the camera through the lighting console and feedback that and go from there. So again, different console manufacturers, I've been talking to them and sort of said, hey, if you're going to do color mixing for camera, come and talk to us because we'll be able to turn around and help you. So essentially, yes, the color palettes that I make would be color palettes specifically to the LED, specifically to Rec 709 or Rec 2020, because the one thing that there is that so many times I have seen on camera electric blue going and just the saturation is just off into a legal color. It may look good by eye. People may say, oh, that's great and wonderful. And on camera, it's just bleeding in and smearing into other sort of things. That's because they're dealing in 709. The saturation is too great. If all of a sudden in 2020, it would be fine. So again, we turn around and help them that. So now we know where those limits are. But again, it's one of those one day I can only chase so many windmills. Anyways. Okay. Any other questions coming up? So, I mean, it sounds like people are looking for this and people are sort of wanting this. I'm glad because it's been something that I've been doing for a number of years. And I think that it's just a matter of making it simple for people is the key. And I love the fact that now we've got that whole reference line. And look at if you're at IBC, push manufacturers on it. That's the only way to turn around and do it. Again, you see Nicholas at DMG Roscoe, talk to them. And if they want to do more testing, that's great. I know that other manufacturers have been talking to us, but I think it's a simpler answer. I know other manufacturers are talking about let's make calibration specific to the camera, and I know the techniques they're using. I just think this is much easier for them. It's just put the camera up, put the chart up, put whatever, and align it. And if you want it aligned to another, then store this. So as you're saying, not really sort of a LUT per se, because LUT, is sort of over something. I'm looking at something sort of baked in, so to speak, in the light. So it's baked into that light and imposed. So it's simplicity. It's brilliant. Well, I thank you, Guy, on that. I showed this Jeff at BSC, last BSC, and he liked it also. And so again, as an end user, I think it's helpful. But again, it's like I'm just putting a number of people are going to be at IBC. Hopefully, the other thing to talk to is Peter at Brothers and Sons. He liked the whole system also, and he's fully aware. Is actually he brought me over to Copenhagen, and I spoke to the Danish Technical University there, their photonic division, about the whole system and how it should be used for evaluation. And they liked the whole thing, and brothers and sons are on board with it also. So he's another person. So again, just if you think it's simple, if it's worthwhile, if you're seeing manufacturers, it's going to be customers are going to have to drive it. And again, use that discount for DSC and buy yourself a chart. But anyways, any discount for us?
Sure.
Well, that's a James call.
Absolutely. We'd be happy to match what DSC is doing and give you 20% if you want to order it from us.
And I've got people's email address, so I can share that with James, and he can give a.
There's a code for you, HS Scope 20.
Okay, there you go. He's already done it. Okay.
Give me 10 minutes to go tell sales.
Yeah, don't download it right now. Yeah. Okay. Again, all of these sort of things, and I know DSC. I've used them for a number of years, so they are courteous enough to try and give that sort of discount thing. And again, glad that James would throw something together there.
And with that chart, they're giving the discount on it. We'll work with this perfectly. It has all the chips we need to do a basic calibration, so it's really handy to have.
Yeah,
Chroma demands, more accurate, but not more accurate. It's got more chips.
Yeah, yeah, basically. And that's the other thing too is that the whole thing with the DSC Labs chart, if I get one chart, it's the same as the other. So all the values are sitting there. I may have less chips compared to the Chroma Demont, and if I got more chips, then it's has some of the bases of the Chroma Demont and sort of go from there. But at least the big thing is the printing is accurate. That's the real. That's why everybody goes to them.
Right. 2 questions in the comments. Yes, so with Resolve, so interestingly, the 4K scope can speak to Assimilate, Nucoda, Premiere, After Effects, Media Composer, all those guys in a shared mode with if you're using an Azure board. So we can share the Azure boards. You have one board giving your output, and we're scoping it at the same time, real time, while you're working in your creative software. You can also use NDI as a transport between any of those things to the scope on the same machine. Resolve, of course, only works with Blackmagic boards. Blackmagic boards don't support shared mode. So unfortunately, the people we have working with Resolve tend to put a second card in or a UTAP on our USB 3 to bring the signal back to us to be scoped.
If you guys could post the questions, that might help people, because when we do the playback afterwards, when we answer it, you can actually go to that section of it. Actually ties it timeline into that question. Anyways, so Jeff had the question of, will it work with Chroma Match? And I'm suspecting you're talking about the Chroma Match Pro in that chart. Yeah, because it's the same colors.
Yeah.
Right. Whoops. Yeah. I mean, I do have the Chroma Match, and we've used the Chroma Match. So yes, it'll work with that chart too.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Gary said, great event. Hit the discount again. Okay, it is. I will say the discount for BD, the discount for the DSC, and I'll put that here. It's coming up in chat. So that's the code for the 20% discount on the one shot. Again, credit that to Art Adams on developing the one shot. So CYWBD is a 20% discount on the when you purchase it from the DSC Labs store. Okay, well, all right, no problem. We do have a poll there if anybody has taken that and all. I just got some questions that people going to answer before, and that'd be great. Any other questions come about? Okay, thank you, Amar. Is there any other questions? Because what I'd like to do is, I wouldn't mind having Jeff James go over some of the other sort of features with regards to the 4K scope. Do a little bit of a roundabout, because I know some of the sort of stuff that it does. Like if all of a sudden you're doing a chroma key, if all of a sudden you want to turn around to focus, you want to do all this sort of stuff.
Sure. Yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
We'll see you, Jeff. Thank you very much.
Yeah, guys. So we're going to head away from the HRS scope. I'll just give you some general waveform vector stuff from 4K scope for anybody who's interested. So to start with, you can have up to 6 scopes on the screen. As I said, this runs under Linux, Windows, or Mac, so any of your platforms. Basically, yeah, so you can have 6 scopes, 4 scopes, 2 scopes, or 1 scope up at a time. So I'm going to go to the 2 scope view because that's the easiest to tell the various scopes, and I'll just run through them. The first thing you have, of course, on the left here is the picture. And with the picture, you can have safe zones and action zones, and these are adjustable. The other thing about the picture is that you can have it showing different aspects of the picture. So that's a full color picture. You can do Luma only, red, green, and blue. You can take a zebra to find the hotspots in the Luma. Similarly, you can find the hotspots in the chroma. You can look for clipping, edge difference, focus assist. You can do calibrations directly if you want to compensate for the camera in some way. Flip and flop just lets you turn the image if the camera is not aligned properly for normal viewing. You can show the alpha if it's a 4444 signal. This isn't, so there's no alpha. You can do an opacity where you can load in an image, and then you can switch between the image and the live signal for doing comparisons. You can check for Luma keys and various chroma and green screen keys. So you can adjust your, it's especially helpful if you want to adjust your green screen while you're looking at, through the camera, and false color, which lets you see the overall exposure of the system. In terms of the scopes, I'll do those on the right. Whoops, that's the picture which we've already done. So vector scope. So the vector scope has your 2 times for the DSC charts, of course. It has a low pass filter, so you can take out any of the muck the camera's putting in and just go for the actual chips. And you can turn on and off any parts of the graticule. You can have it colorized or just in black and white. And you can also, there's the 2 times, but you can also just scale arbitrarily, and you can move the picture around and then click it back into place with the right click. Waveform is a YCBCR waveform. It can also do Luma only. Of course, you can change it to white. We have a number of different scale types for depending on what you're most comfortable with. And if you're doing an HDR signal, we also have HLG and HDR10 SMPTE 2084 support. Again, there's also a low pass, so you can tune the signal in. You can see it as a parade or as a over-under. And you can also do it as an overlay or a Luma only. Waveform RGB is very similar. It's just looking at the RGB components instead of the YCRCB. That one you can also overlay, so you can see the differences between the reds and greens, especially when you're looking at things that are white. And you can look at it as a full scale or as a standard scale. You can also take out the color. The histogram, the main histogram, of course, is the that we showed was the HS scope. That's sort of the newest and coolest. But you also have more traditional scopes. You can do a YCRCB histogram, RGB histogram, HSV, hue, saturation, and volume or value, or a straight Luma. There's a CIE chromaticity or a gamut display, and we have triangles for P3 2020 709. You can view it either as a color within or as a white or a black dot on the actual color, depending which one you prefer. The status is where we get all of our alarms and checks. So we look for gamut over and under in the YU and V area. Saturation, we look for mins, max, and averages. Broadcast illegal pixels, a repetition, If you're doing HDR, max CLL and max fall, and then audio, peak RMS and loudness, which I'll get to in a sec. And there's a couple of audio meters. We don't really have much audio in this signal, but you have your traditional audio vector, audio phase, histogram, and then straight wave.
James, sorry to interrupt. There's a question that I'll leave for you. It's come up. I don't know if you can see it. I'll do the start answer. In 4K scope software on the viewer where you see the image, can we put an L3D LUT that is intended for monitor calibration?
Not just yet. That is something we've actually been working on in-house, 2D and 3D LUTs for the picture, but that part hasn't shipped yet. But that is certainly coming. So that's those are the scopes. In terms of setup, depending on what kind of card you have, you'll have your input, your signal formats, which go all the way up to 8K now on the 8K scope. How your color's coming in, 8 or 10-bit YCRCB or up to 12-bit RGB. The primaries you're using, which are going to be either your traditional 601, 709, 2020. You can also do a full RGB set, which is really handy when monitoring things like RGB out of DaVinci, which isn't SMPTE, it's actually full. And then, DCI P3 and display P3. There's the SDR versus the HDR10 and HLG systems. And then if the card has them, you can do different picture modes, up converts, down converts. We have full support for decoding 601, 608, 708, and OP47 captions. They appear over here as present and what's present, and then we actually draw the captions on the picture. Audio input depending on the card, and then audio scale. We have most of your popular systems. So you can do RMS, SMPTE 155, the loudness at EBU 9 or 18, and then EBU PPM, BBC PPM, all your standard kinds of meters you would want to have depending on your system. You can select the boards directly if you have more than one board in the system, and you can select one of multiple boards if you're using multiple of the same board. It also has support along with all your high-end cards for direct show and NDI, and even the old Ultrascope hardware if you have that kicking around. You can do a auto follow, so it'll change the input as necessary, and you can scope the vertical blank as well as the main picture. And you can also select sections of the picture to look at just that area in any of the scopes.
Okay, James. Well, I just got a notification from the service I'm using that essentially our time is sort of running.
Oh, okay.
So
that's almost it. The only last things were you can see the actual pixels directly. You can save and load images, raw frames, JPEGs, all that stuff. And there's a web interface that lets you actually see this all through the web. And that's pretty much.
Another quick question here. We'll start answering it. Okay, yeah, I've got the number. Last question. Can we set a separate color for any values exceeding a specific line in the waveform that we decide? Let's say I want to see all values that are more than 98% in the waveform in red color. Is it possible? It will help us when grading. I have 10-year-old JVC monitor that has an exciting feature. It would be great to have.
Yes, you can do it on the picture. Whoops. By selecting the clipping, and then you can actually adjust it so it clips just the very top 98% and the low 0 all the way down to 0. So you can change the clips green on the bottom and red on the top, so you can find those values. And if you're looking at the waveform, we actually, if it goes under or over these values, and I don't have it, I'm not doing it right here, but it turns red on top and bottom, so you can see that there's overs and unders.
Okay, well, let's see if there's any other questions before we run away. Hopefully people have been interested in this, and hopefully they start pounding on the manufacturer's doors and start saying, hey, I want to see your HS scope readings. All right. All right. Well, one more call out for questions. Anybody else have last questions before we run away? Alrighty. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. And thank you, James.
Thank you. Thanks for putting this together,
and
Brad.
so
Appreciate it.
I think we'll wrap it up for now. Thank everybody. This will replay for those who are registered on the same website. All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you again. All right. Bye now. All right. No problem to everybody. All right. Okay. Thank you very much. And the bottom line is that it'll happen more and more if all of a sudden people start pushing it out there. Okay. Thanks again. Take care. Bye.